Story 1: The Intruder in the Walls. Megan had just moved into her first solo apartment. It was a cozy place in an older building, charming yet with a few quirks. She noticed odd noises at night, creaks and faint scratching sounds, but she assumed it was just the building settling or maybe mice in the walls. One evening, though, Megan was woken by a loud thump directly behind her bedroom wall, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen, but the sounds eventually stopped. Over the next few weeks, the noises became more frequent. Convinced that something was wrong, she decided to investigate. She called maintenance to inspect the walls for rodents or structural issues. When they finally opened a section of the wall, they found a small, makeshift room hidden between the walls. Inside, there were old blankets, empty food containers, and a single, stained notebook filled with incoherent scribblings and Megan's name, repeated dozens of times. The realization hit her hard: someone had been living in her walls, watching her, studying her. The intruder had likely been entering and exiting through a narrow vent in the basement. The maintenance team closed up the space and notified the police, but the man was never found. For months, Megan couldn't sleep, always listening for any faint noises that might signal his return. She eventually moved out, but she never felt alone in her own space again. Story 2: The Man in the Cemetery. Alex and his friends often visited local spots that were rumored to be haunted. One night, they decided to explore an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. They laughed and joked, daring each other to take pictures or walk alone down the narrow paths between the graves. But when Alex snapped a photo of his friend, something unusual happened. In the image, just over his friend's shoulder, was a shadowy figure of a man, staring directly at the camera with an unsettling gaze. Thinking it was just a trick of the light, they continued exploring. But as they walked further into the cemetery, they all began to feel uneasy, as though someone was watching them. Alex's friend pointed to a spot in the distance. A figure stood there, motionless, dressed in a black suit and hat, partially obscured by the shadows of a tree. As soon as they looked, the man began to move toward them, his pace slow but deliberate. Panic set in, and they ran back toward their car. When they looked back, the man had vanished. But the story doesn't end there. Later that night, Alex reviewed the photo he had taken and zoomed in on the figure's face. It was hauntingly clear and pale, with dark eyes that seemed far too hollow. Disturbed, he deleted the photo, but he continued to have nightmares about the man for weeks. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Alex would wake up to find his bedroom window wide open, even though he remembered locking it. He never returned to that cemetery. Story 3: The Silent Passenger. Lisa had always been a careful driver, and she usually avoided driving late at night. But one evening, on a long drive back from visiting her parents, she found herself on a dark, desolate stretch of highway, utterly alone. After about an hour of empty road, her car radio crackled to life with sudden static, startling her. She switched it off, but a chill crept down her spine. As she continued driving, she caught a glimpse of something in her rearview mirror. A figure sat silently in the back seat, staring at her with empty, sunken eyes. She froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly, afraid to turn around. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. She brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on her. Minutes later, she felt a cold, clammy hand rest on her shoulder. Lisa screamed, swerving to the side of the road. When she turned around, there was no one there, just the empty silence of her car. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head and continued driving. But the entire way home, she felt an oppressive presence, watching her from the back seat. When she arrived home, she dashed into her house and locked the door, still shaken. The next morning, she found a single, wet handprint on her shoulder, chilling her to the core. She avoided that road from then on and never drove alone at night again, but she would often wake up in the middle of the night with the same feeling of cold hands on her shoulders. She could never explain who, or what, had joined her on that lonely drive.